On the 11th of December 2026, the worst blizzard in a century hit the city, burying streets and freezing the rivers solid. Huddled against the freezing wrought iron gates of a sprawling, dark mansion, 8-year-old Angela watched a tiny figure stumble through the blinding whiteout. It was a little boy, no older than 6, shivering violently, missing a shoe, and crying out for a father who wasn't there. Knowing the cold would take him within the hour, Angela abandoned the meager shelter of her cardboard windbreak. She dragged the boy against the gate, wrapped him in her only heavy blanket, and held him tight, unaware that the frantic men sprinting through the snow toward them were led by Riccardo Balde, the city's most lethal Mafia boss and the boy's desperate father. Before we go further, I don't have a big studio or a huge team. It's just me and my laptop trying to bring these stories to life. If you'd like to help a small creator keep this channel going, you can buy me a coffee at the link below. Every bit truly helps. Thank you, stranger. The black SUVs tore through the blizzard like sharks cutting dark water, their headlights carving twin columns through the whiteout. Angela barely registered the movement of men around her. Large hands, the smell of expensive cologne, the muffled bark of commands she couldn't quite hear over the wind screaming in her ears, or someone had draped a wool coat across her shoulders. Cashmere, though she didn't know the word for it. She only knew it was the softest thing that had ever touched her skin, and she didn't trust it for a second. Riccardo sat in the rear of the lead vehicle. Benjamin pressed against his chest, the boy's fists knotted in his father's dress shirt. He hadn't loosened his grip since the moment Riccardo had lifted him from the snow. Angela had been placed in the seat beside them, a bodyguard on her other side, the door sealed before she could even think about running. She had thought about running. She always thought about running. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass and watched the city disappear behind walls of white. The estate materialized from the storm like something Angela might have dreamed once, and then forced herself to forget. A vast, stone-fronted manor set behind iron gates, identical to the ones she had sheltered beside all season. Except these were twice as tall and flanked by security cameras, whose red lights blinked steady as a heartbeat. The courtyard alone was larger than the block she usually slept on. Floodlights turned the falling snow gold. She didn't remember being carried inside. She remembered heat, sudden and overwhelming, and marble floors the color of winter cream, and a staircase so wide she could have laid her cardboard sheet across it twice. Then nothing. Sleep had taken her before she could fight it, though she woke in a room that made no sense. The bed beneath her was enormous, upholstered in slate-grey linen, so smooth it felt ironed. A crystal lamp on the nightstand threw warm, amber light across walls the color of morning fog. Someone had dressed her in soft pajamas that smelled faintly of lavender. Her torn coat was gone. Her boots were gone. On the dresser, arranged like something out of a shop window, she had pressed her nose against many times, sat a porcelain dish, a folded robe with a monogram stitched in gold thread, and a glass of water with actual ice cubes floating in it. Angela sat up slowly and catalogued every exit. One door, almost certainly to a hallway. 2 windows, floor to ceiling, framed by heavy drapes. She slid from the bed and crossed the room in her bare feet, pulling the drape aside. 3 stories up. Stone facade below, no ledge worth trusting. She filed it away anyway. Or the door to the hallway opened onto plush carpet and the distant sound of low voices. She pulled it shut and turned back. There was a second door, narrower. She tried the handle. A walk-in wardrobe, empty except for a few plastic-wrapped garment bags and the ghost of cedar. She stepped inside, pressed her back against the far wall, and stood very still in the dark, measuring the silence. This was what people didn't understand about her. She wasn't searching for a way out because she was ungrateful. She was searching because gratitude had gotten her hurt before. A shelter worker who had smiled that same wide smile. A couple who had taken her in for 11 days before deciding she was too much trouble. Warmth, in Angela's experience, was borrowed. You had to know where the door was before the warmth ran out. She returned to the bedroom and stood at the window again, watching the storm. It had eased slightly, the blizzard settling into a steady, punishing snowfall. The estate's grounds were lit and landscaped, even under all that white. She could make out sculpted hedgerows, the outline of a fountain gone silent and frozen, a cobblestone path that wound toward what looked like a garage block, housing vehicles she couldn't name but knew were expensive. She heard footsteps in the hall, deliberate, unhurried. They stopped outside her door. At a knock, 3 quiet raps, nothing like the pounding she had learned to brace for. Angela said nothing. She pressed herself to the wall beside the door, just to the hinge side, and waited. "There is food outside the door." Ricardo's voice was low, careful, the same voice he might use near a wounded animal he did not want to startle. "You don't have to open it. I'll leave it there." Silence. Then the soft sound of something being set on the floor, then footsteps retreating. She waited a full 4 minutes before she cracked the door. On the floor sat a tray, warm soup in a bowl rimmed with gold, a cloth napkin pressed into a perfect fold, and beside it, washed and neatly folded, her blanket, torn edges and all. Angela stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up, wrapped it around her shoulders and sat against the wall to eat. The estate had a rhythm to it, and Angela spent the early hours of the morning learning it. Though she had slept in fragments, 90 minutes here, 40 there, the way she always slept, one ear always open. By the time pale grey light began seeping through the heavy drapes, she had already mapped the hallway outside her door, counted 14 steps to the main staircase landing, and identified a service corridor behind a panel that looked like part of the wall. She hadn't gone through it yet. She was saving it. A woman named Dorota brought breakfast at 7. She was broad-shouldered and unhurried, with silver-streaked hair pinned close to her head, and she set the tray on the bedside table without making eye contact, not in the way of someone dismissive, but in the way of someone who understood that direct attention could feel like a threat. The tray held warm rolls, a soft-boiled egg in a porcelain cup monogrammed with a cursive B, fresh orange juice in a crystal glass, and a small pot of honey beside a dish of salted butter. Angela watched Dorota leave, then ate every crumb standing up, facing the door. Benjamin appeared mid-morning, led by the hand by a different member of staff, a quiet young man named Felix, who spoke to the boy in soft tones, and then retreated to the hallway, leaving the 2 children alone. Benjamin walked straight to Angela and sat beside her on the edge of the bed without asking permission. He was wearing miniature navy trousers and a cream sweater that probably cost more than anything Angela had ever touched. His hair had been combed. He still had the eyes of a boy who hadn't slept, ringed faintly violet beneath. But he wasn't crying. He leaned against her arm. She let him. They sat like that for a while, not talking, looking at the snow still falling beyond the window. She heard Ricardo before she saw anything. His voice carried from somewhere below. Not the careful, measured voice from the night before, but something older and harder, stripped of its patience. She told herself not to be curious. Curiosity was how you ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. She told Benjamin to stay, and she drifted to the door, cracking it open by an inch. The sound rose from the ground floor. She moved to the landing and pressed herself against the carved mahogany balustrade and looked down. Ricardo stood in the center of the main hall, and the man seated across from him in a high-backed chair, Carrara marble floor beneath his feet, a chandelier of hand-blown Venetian glass blazing above his head, was visibly shaking. He was not a small man. That detail registered somewhere in Angela's chest and settled there, cold and specific. She couldn't hear every word. She caught enough. Names, places, a date. The name of a street she recognized, one she had slept near twice last autumn. Ricardo's voice never rose. That, though she understood immediately, was the most frightening part. Men who shouted were spending something. Men who stayed quiet while someone shook across from them were not spending anything at all. They had reserves she couldn't see the bottom of. Two of his men stood at the room's edges, like furniture that breathed. When Ricardo finally stepped back, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, Brioni, though the label meant nothing to her, only the precision of the fabric, and nodded once, while the two men stepped forward and escorted the shaking man out of the room. Ricardo watched them go. Then he looked up. Not directly at her, slightly to the left, but close enough that Angela pulled back from the railing and flattened herself against the wall, heart hammering, breath tight. She held still for a long count of 10. Then she moved quickly and quietly back down the hall, slipped through her door, and stood inside with her back pressed to it. Benjamin was where she'd left him, rolling one of the decorative brass spheres from the nightstand dish between his small palms, watching it catch light. Angela stood at the window. Her hands were steady because she had trained them to be, but her mind was already running calculations. The service corridor behind the false panel, the garage block she'd seen from the window, at least 4 vehicles, which meant at least one set of keys somewhere. The cobblestone path curved toward the south end of the property. Beyond the wall, where she'd glimpsed a tree line meant cover. She began counting. She needed her boots. She needed something warmer than the robe. She needed Benjamin distracted long enough that he wouldn't follow her. Behind her, Benjamin set the brass sphere carefully back in its dish and looked at her. "Are you going to leave?" he asked. The question was so plain, so without accusation, that it landed harder than anything shouted could have. Angela turned from the window. She didn't answer him, but she also didn't move toward the door. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and indifferent, covering every path she might have taken. The first night terror came at 2:30. Angela heard it through the wall, a sound that didn't begin as a scream, but arrived as one, the way a storm announces itself only after it's already on top of you, high, ragged, desperate. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, the tattered blanket sliding from her shoulders, her body already making decisions her mind hadn't caught up to. She was in the hallway in seconds. The sound was coming from the room 2 doors down. She had already noted it as Benjamin's, logged the detail the same way she logged everything, automatically, without sentiment. She pushed the door open. He was sitting upright in the center of a bed that dwarfed him, sheets twisted around his waist, his face contorted in a terror so complete that his eyes were open but not seeing. But he was breathing in short, shallow pulls, hands gripping the duvet, ivory silk, edged in pale blue satin, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Angela crossed the room without hesitating and sat beside him. She didn't reach for him immediately. She had learned, from nights in shelters where other children cried, that grabbing someone mid-terror only made the walls close faster. "Benjamin." She kept her voice flat and even. "You're in the house. The big house with the gates. You're in your room." His breathing stuttered. "Benjamin." A little firmer. "Count the lights on the ceiling with me." He couldn't, of course. There were no lights on the ceiling, but the instruction made him look up, made his eyes focus on something, made the room reassemble itself around him piece by piece. His breathing slowed. His grip on the duvet loosened by degrees. Then he turned and looked at her, and something in his face broke open and reformed in the space of a single second. He wrapped both arms around her middle and held on. Angela sat very still. She was not accustomed to being held. She was not accustomed to being needed in this particular way, not for what she could carry or find or know, but simply for being present. It felt strange, and it felt heavy, and she bore it anyway, the way she bore most things. She stayed until his breathing evened and deepened. Then she stayed a little longer. By the third night, Dorota had stopped coming to the door during the episodes. She would appear in the morning with 2 breakfast trays and an expression that said she understood perfectly well how the nights were going, and she would set them both on Benjamin's table without comment. The tray for Angela always included a second cup of the dark, excellent coffee that she had not asked for, but had drunk to the last drop the first time it appeared. She told herself she was staying because of the coffee, because the sheets in her own room were softer than anything she had ever slept on, because the alternative, the tree line, the frozen path, the cobblestones, was still there, and she was simply waiting for better conditions. She did not examine this reasoning too closely. Ricardo knew. She could tell he knew because he stopped appearing in doorways when she was nearby, as though he understood that the only way to keep a bird from startling was to make yourself smaller than the room. She would catch him sometimes, at the far end of the corridor or below in the entrance hall, and he would nod once without approaching and move on. He wore it lightly, that deliberate restraint, the way he wore the charcoal Loro Piana cardigan she had seen him in twice now, as if the effort cost him nothing. It cost him something. She could tell that too. On the 4th night, Benjamin woke screaming, and then, mid-scream, stopped, because she was already there, already seated on the edge of his bed, already talking him back through the ceiling, back through the room, back into his own body. He looked at her afterward with an expression that was entirely too trusting for Angela's comfort. "You came before I even finished," he said, hushed and wondering. "You're loud," she told him. He almost smiled. "Will you sleep here? On the chair?" There was a chair in the corner, a low, wide armchair, upholstered in cognac leather, of the kind of chair that had a name in a catalogue she had never seen. She pulled her blanket from her shoulder and settled into it without answering. Benjamin lay back down and watched her until his eyes closed. Angela stayed awake a long time, listening to the wind move over the estate. She did not calculate the distance to the tree line that night. The packages began appearing on the 5th morning. The first arrived before breakfast, a wide, flat box in heavy cream cardboard, tied with a ribbon the color of dried roses, set outside her door the way the soup tray had been on that first night. Angela stared at it from the doorway for a moment, then stepped over it and went to find Dorota. By the time she returned, a second box had joined the first. Smaller, square, wrapped in paper that had a texture like fabric. She left them both where they sat. Dorota, to her credit, said nothing. She simply set Angela's breakfast tray on the table by the window and withdrew, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floor. Benjamin appeared after breakfast and looked at the unopened boxes in the hallway with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Those are for you," he said. "I know." "You didn't open them?" "I know." He considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old confronting a genuine philosophical problem. Then he followed her inside and they played the ceiling counting game, which had evolved, in recent days, into an elaborate invented geography where each crack in the plaster was a river or a road, until Felix came to collect him for lessons. The boxes multiplied over the following 2 days. A long garment box appeared, then a pair of smaller ones stacked together, then something in a velvet drawstring bag that clinked softly when the staff member who delivered it set it at her threshold. Angela counted 7 in total. She recognized some of the names embossed on the packaging, names she had seen in shop windows on the better streets of the city, the kind of windows she had learned not to stop in front of for too long. A coat, she guessed. Shoes, certainly. Perhaps a watch in that velvet bag. Something with a clasp. She had not touched a single one. On the 3rd day, Ricardo came himself. To be honest, YouTube doesn't always make it easy for small channels to survive. If you enjoy spending your afternoons or late nights with my stories, please consider supporting me through Buy Me a Coffee. It helps me keep these videos free for everyone. He appeared in the hallway mid-afternoon, still in his working clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearm, a watch on his wrist that caught the light from the overhead fitting. He looked at the untouched arrangement of boxes, and something moved briefly across his face. Not offense. More like a man recalculating a route he thought he had already mapped. He knocked on her open door and waited. Angela was seated at the window in the cognac armchair she had moved from Benjamin's room 2 days ago, the tattered blanket across her lap. She looked at him and said nothing. "You haven't opened them," he said. I noticed. He was quiet a moment. She could see him choosing his words with some care, the way she had seen him do that first morning. It was the effort visible only if you were paying close attention. "I thought you might want—" "Where's my blanket?" Ricardo paused. "The one from outside? The one they took when I got here?" She kept her voice even. "It wasn't in my room when I woke up. They gave it back eventually, but then it disappeared again after the laundry." She looked at him steadily. "That's the one I want." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and left the hallway without another word. 30 minutes later, Felix appeared at her door holding the blanket, washed and dried, the torn edges exactly as ragged as before, nothing repaired or altered. Angela took it from him, shook it out once, and spread it across her lap over the warmer throw that was already there. She did not say, "Thank you," but she didn't look away when Ricardo passed the doorway later that evening, and that, she understood, was more than she had given anyone in longer than she could clearly remember. As the boxes remained in the hall. That night, after Benjamin had been settled, she heard Ricardo in the corridor and spoke to the half-open door. "You can move them," she said. "The boxes?" He appeared in the frame. "All right. I'm not saying I don't want things." She kept her eyes on the window. The snow had eased to something lighter, almost soft. "I'm saying I don't know you well enough yet." The word yet landed in the space between them, and neither of them acknowledged it directly. Ricardo leaned one shoulder against the door frame in a way that was, for the first time, not careful, not managed, simply tired and present. "That's fair," he said. Angela pulled the old blanket tighter around her shoulders, that threadbare, patched, irreplaceable thing, and said nothing more. Somewhere below, the estate's clock marked the hour, and the snow kept falling, softly now, like something that had finally decided to be gentle. It started with Benjamin. Most things, what Angela had come to notice, started with Benjamin. He appeared in the doorway of the grand living room on a Tuesday afternoon with a cushion tucked under each arm, and the particular expression he wore when he had already decided something and was only informing the world after the fact. The living room was the largest interior space Angela had yet mapped. High coffered ceilings, a fireplace wide enough to stand in, furniture upholstered in deep charcoal and ivory, a hand-knotted rug that stretched the length of the room in shades of slate and cream. On the far wall, floor-to-ceiling shelves held books arranged by the color of their spines, which Angela found both beautiful and suspicious. Benjamin dropped his cushions on the rug and looked at her. "We're building a fort." "Who is we?" He pointed past her. She turned. Ricardo was standing in the side doorway, holding, but with the focused expression of a man completing a task he had been given clear instructions about, an armful of folded blankets. He was still in his morning clothes, a fine knit charcoal sweater that sat close against his shoulders, dark trousers, no watch for once, which made him look, Angela thought, like a slightly different person. Less like someone running something, more like someone just in a room. He looked at her, then at the cushions on the floor, then back at her. "He's been planning this since breakfast," he said. Not an apology, just information. Angela looked at Benjamin, who had begun dragging a cushion toward the base of the large sofa, with considerable intent. She sat down cross-legged on the rug and watched. Within 10 minutes it became clear that Ricardo, for all the authority he carried in every other room of this house, had no instinctive feel for fort architecture. He draped a blanket across the sofa back, and it slid off immediately. He tried to anchor it with a throw pillow, and the whole arrangement tilted. Benjamin offered corrections in the serious, patient tone of someone who had clearly thought about this more than anyone else present. "The corners have to be tucked," Benjamin explained. "Angela knows." They both looked at her. Angela looked at the sofa. She looked at the pile of blankets, Mongolian cashmere, cloud soft, in shades of oat and warm grey, the kind of thing she had once pressed her fingers against through a shop window on Delancey Street. She stood, picked up the longest one, and shook it out. "You need 2 anchor points and 1 overhang," she said. "Otherwise the roof collapses on the side." She looped one end over the sofa back and tucked it deep into the seat cushion. She directed Ricardo to hold the other end taut while she retrieved a second blanket, the heavier one, or better for the outer wall, and showed Benjamin where to sit his weight on the corner to keep it from pulling. Ricardo did as he was told without comment. He was, she noted, good at holding things steady. The fort took shape in 20 minutes, low and close and dark inside, with the firelight pressing orange through the gaps in the weave. Art, it smelled of cedar and something warm she didn't have a name for, wood smoke and clean laundry and the faint trace of whatever expensive thing Dorota used on the furniture. Benjamin crawled inside immediately and declared it perfect in the emphatic way that 6-year-olds declared things. Ricardo lowered himself onto the rug outside the entrance, back against the sofa, and stretched his legs out. It looked effortful in the way of a large man trying to make himself fit somewhere modest, and he managed it without complaint. Angela sat near the entrance, not quite in, not quite out. Dorota arrived without being summoned. Angela suspected she arrived without being summoned for most things, carrying a tray with 3 cups of warm drinking chocolate, real chocolate, not the powdered kind Angela had sometimes found behind grocery stores. The cups were bone china, delicate as a held breath. Benjamin reached his arm out through the fort entrance for his cup and pulled it inside, as Angela wrapped both hands around hers. The warmth moved through her palms, up her forearms, into the place in her chest that was usually braced. Ricardo sipped his quietly. The fire shifted and settled. Benjamin began narrating something from inside the fort, a story he was inventing as he spoke, something about a fortress in the mountains, a boy who could talk to snow. Angela looked sideways at Ricardo. He was watching the fort entrance with an expression she had not seen on him before, and something open, something that had put all its weight down and was simply resting. Without planning to, without deciding to, Angela smiled. It lasted only a moment, but it was real, and when she turned back to the firelight, she didn't take it back. The change came quietly, the way most dangerous things did. Angela noticed it first in the guards. She had spent enough time studying the estate's rhythms to know them the way she had once known the rhythms of the street. Which vendor left, which corner at which hour, which doorway stayed dry longest in the rain, which sounds belonged to the night and which ones didn't. The mansion had its own version of all of this. The security rotation ran on a reliable 2-hour cycle. The overnight team arrived at 9 and moved in pairs. There were 4 cameras on the south wall, 2 on the east. No, and one, she had confirmed this from the service corridor, that swept wide enough to cover the garage block gate, but left a narrow blind strip near the old groundskeeper's entrance. She had noted the blind strip 17 days ago. She still hadn't used it. What she noticed now was that the rotation had stretched, not dramatically, 10 minutes, perhaps 15, but enough to create gaps in coverage that hadn't existed before. She clocked it on a Wednesday, then confirmed it Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, she was certain. Something had shifted in the estate's interior as well. Ricardo's study, on the ground floor east wing, had been occupied continuously for the past 2 days. She heard voices through the heavy oak door when she passed, never clearly, always low, occasionally cut with the kind of weighted silence that meant the conversation was going somewhere difficult. Men she hadn't seen before moved through the entrance hall and disappeared into rooms she hadn't been inside. One of them wore a coat she recognized as Ermenegildo Zegna by the cut of its collar. She had seen it on a man who used to walk past her corner every morning on the good side of the city, always with a briefcase, always looking like someone important. The man wearing it here did not look like someone important. He looked like someone delivering something uncomfortable. Yet Dorota maintained her routines with careful precision, trays at the correct times, fires in the correct rooms, not a single detail out of place. But her expression had taken on a particular quality, focused, tightly managed. The expression of someone keeping their hands very busy so their face didn't say too much. Angela said nothing to Benjamin about any of it. He was having a good day, which was its own kind of information, and she didn't want to interrupt it. He had commandeered the low table in the sitting room, adjacent to his bedroom, and was assembling something architectural from a set of polished wooden blocks that had arrived in a lacquered box, a gift from a week ago that he had only just started using. Angela sat nearby with a book she was working her way through slowly, sounding out the longer words in her head, and kept her attention split evenly between the page and the hallway beyond the open door. Ricardo appeared at 4:30. He was dressed as though he had been somewhere formal, a dark suit, a silk tie that had been loosened but not removed, the Patek Philippe on his wrist catching the lamplight as he leaned in the doorframe. He looked at Benjamin's construction project and said something quiet and approving. He looked at Angela, and she met his eyes, and she watched him decide not to say what he had been about to say and replace it with something neutral instead. "Dorota will have dinner ready at 6, he said. Then he moved on, back toward the study. The oak door closed again. Angela set her book face down on the arm of the chair and thought. The loosened tie, the unfamiliar men, the stretched rotation and the covered cameras, and the way Felix had moved this morning with his shoulders held differently, too high, too aware. All of these things were individual. None of them was alone. She rose quietly and went to the window at the end of the corridor. From here she could see the south courtyard, and, at its far edge, The groundskeeper's entrance she had catalogued weeks ago. A man was standing near it who had not been there this morning. He was facing the wrong direction to be watching the exterior. He was watching the interior of the estate. Angela stood at the window for a long time. She thought about the service corridor behind the false panel. She thought about the ventilation grate she had discovered on the Upper East Side, or the one that opened over the linen storage room on the floor below. She thought about every route she had mapped across 5 weeks of careful, quiet observation, routes she had intended for herself alone. She was still thinking about them when she went back to sit beside Benjamin, but her reasons had changed completely. The storm came back on a Friday, not the gradual kind that built itself politely over hours, giving the city time to prepare. This one arrived at the tail end of afternoon, like something that had been waiting. Sky darkening in 20 minutes, wind picking up so sharply that the tall windows on the east side of the estate trembled in their frames. By 5 o'clock, the grounds were disappearing behind a wall of driven snow that moved horizontally, fast and purposeful, erasing the south courtyard, the frozen fountain, the tree line Angela had once measured her escape against. She watched it come from the corridor window and felt something settle in her chest. Not fear. Something older than fear. The particular alertness she had learned to trust above everything else. She found Benjamin in his room and sat with him through dinner. Dorota brought the trays up without explanation, which was itself an explanation. The fire in the bedroom had been stoked high, the room warm and close, the smell of cedar and wood smoke thick in the air. Benjamin ate without concern, though still narrating the ongoing mythology of his wooden block city, adding new districts and trade routes, and a complicated political arrangement between the blocks of different heights. Angela listened with half her attention, and kept the other half on the hallway. Ricardo had not come up to say good night. At 7:15 she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, lower than the wind, and deliberate where the wind was not. A compression. Then another, coming from the west side of the ground floor, moving inward. She was on her feet before the third sound. "Benjamin!" She kept her voice the same as always. "We're going to play the quiet game." He looked up from his blocks. He had learned, over the past weeks, to read something in her voice that she kept carefully off her face. He nodded and set the block in his hand down without a word. She took his hand and moved into the corridor. The lights were still on, the estate lit normally, the chandelier at the staircase landing, throwing its familiar warm geometry across the walls. But below, she could hear it now, voices that were not Felix or Dorota, not the measured cadence of Ricardo's security team. Faster, urgent in a way that had no courtesy in it. Then a sound that ended the last of her uncertainty, sharp and brief, coming from the direction of the main hall. Angela moved. She pulled Benjamin past his doorway, past hers, not past the wide end of the corridor where the main staircase opened. She did not go near the staircase, and toward the narrow section of wall that looked exactly like wall, and was not. She pressed the lower left panel the way she had discovered it 5 weeks ago, weight applied at the specific point where the latch was hidden beneath the plaster finish. It swung inward on a dark passage that smelled of old wood and settled dust. Benjamin went in without being asked. She followed and pressed the panel shut behind them. The passage was barely wide enough for an adult to move through sideways, not meant to be found, probably forgotten entirely by everyone currently employed in the estate. Angela had found it, because she had pressed every wall panel in this corridor on her 8th day here. She had walked it twice in the dark, memorizing the distance to the first turn, the low beam that required ducking, but the place where the floor angled down before leveling into the junction that connected to the linen storage corridor on the floor below. She moved from memory, one hand on the wall, other hand holding Benjamin's. He made no sound. She had not expected him to. Below them, through the walls, the estate was no longer quiet. She could hear movement, multiple sets of feet, not coordinated in the way of the security team, dispersed and searching. A door struck open. Something fell. Voices, too close for comfort, working their way through the ground floor rooms. Ricardo's voice, once powerful and controlled, from somewhere on the west side, then nothing from him again, which told her the layout of the house had done its work and separated the residential wing from whatever was happening where he was. He was cut off. She had already known he might be. She had already made her plans without him. She brought Benjamin to the junction and turned east, moving toward the linen room. Above the storage shelf on the far wall, the ventilation grate opened into a cavity that ran between the floors. Beyond that, the old servants' quarters, empty since she had arrived, untouched, with a door that bolted from the inside with a solid iron slide. A room within a house, within a storm. She had mapped every inch of it. She lifted Benjamin over the shelf first, then followed, pulling the grate quietly back into place behind them. Above the sound of the wind, somewhere far below, where the search continued. Here, in the dark, there was only the sound of two children breathing, steady and alive. Angela pulled her old blanket, she had taken to keeping it folded under her arm in the evenings, around Benjamin's shoulders, and settled against the wall to wait. The men reached the residential wing at 8:43. Angela knew because she counted. She had been counting since the first sound, tracking time the way she had once tracked the city's rhythms, not with a clock, but with the steady internal metronome that years of survival had installed in her without asking. She knew how long it took to search a room thoroughly versus how long it took to look inside it. She knew the difference between the footstep of someone moving with purpose and someone moving with uncertainty. The men below were moving with purpose, but they didn't know this house. She did. The servants' quarters sat inside a structural dead space between the east residential wing and the older rear section of the estate, a cavity in the building's bones that appeared on no plan she had ever seen posted anywhere, which meant it appeared on no plan anyone searching this house would be working from. The room itself was small, low-ceilinged, smelling of old linen and undisturbed years. A single cot frame, no mattress, a wooden chair with a split leg, a window, shuttered from inside, or that faced the interior courtyard. The bolt on the door was iron and solid, and she had tested it 6 weeks ago, sliding it twice to confirm it moved cleanly. It was bolted now. Benjamin sat on her lap on the floor against the far wall, both of them below the window line, the old blanket wrapped around them both. He had not made a sound since the passage. She could feel his heart going quickly against her forearm, but his breathing was controlled, and he was working at it. She could feel the deliberate steadiness of it, a 6-year-old choosing to be brave in the specific and effortful way that was so much harder than courage that came naturally. She put her mouth close to his ear. "You're doing it perfectly," she breathed. His heartbeat didn't slow, but his shoulders dropped by a fraction. The footsteps reached the corridor outside the linen storage room below them. She tracked them through the floor, 2 sets, moving together, to pausing at the storage room door. A handle turned. The room was checked and emptied of interest in under 30 seconds, which told her the men were working fast, prioritizing rooms that made obvious sense. A storage room was an obvious sense. The ventilation cavity above it was not. She had understood this when she first found it. She had filed the knowledge away under uses she hadn't yet imagined needing. Above them, the ventilation grate sat in a section of the upper wall that looked, from below, like a standard heating duct. She had pulled it open from inside the cavity by removing 2 screws she'd found already loose, decades of settling, the house working against its own fittings. She had replaced the screws loosely after passing through, leaving the grate flush to the wall. From below, in a dim corridor, in a hurried search, it was invisible. The footsteps moved on. She tracked them east, then north, then up. They were on the residential floor now. She heard her own bedroom door open, the particular sound of that specific door she had memorized in the first week. And then Benjamin's. Both checked quickly. Both empty. Then the footsteps stopped. A pause, long enough to mean something. A conversation she couldn't hear, conducted in low tones, somewhere in the corridor 40 feet, and 1 concealed passage away. She pressed her back harder against the wall and held Benjamin completely still with 1 arm, not squeezing, just steady, a constant pressure that said she was still there and it was still all right. She thought about Ricardo. She thought about him the way she thought about logistical facts, where he was, what he was moving through, what the layout of the West Side meant for his approach to this wing. She had heard him once, early in the breach, and then the house had swallowed him. He was not cut off because he was losing. She understood that now, in a way she hadn't understood it an hour ago. He was cut off because that was how this house worked. It divided and separated and held things apart from each other, and the people who knew it moved through it differently from the people who didn't. She and Ricardo both knew this house. The others did not. The footsteps in the corridor began moving again, this time back toward the staircase, receding. She tracked them down, west, then further. Voices now, raised, coming from the direction of the main hall. And underneath them, a heavier sound that moved through the foundation of the building, like weather. Ricardo. Benjamin lifted his head. He had heard it too. She pressed her hand gently to his cheek and shook her head once. Not yet. She counted. She tracked. She held the silence around them like a thing she had built herself, which, in every way that mattered, she had. Below, the sounds shifted. The searching voices narrowed and compressed, and then there was a period of noise that she did not try to interpret, only to measure. And then, gradually, like the storm itself finding its ceiling, everything began to quiet. A door. Footsteps she recognized, heavier on the right, a pattern she had logged in the first week. Coming up the staircase, coming east along the corridor, stopping outside the linen storage room below. 3 knocks, spaced exactly. Then Ricardo's voice, close and controlled, and pointed like a key at a lock. "No, Angela." She looked at Benjamin. He was already looking at her, his face open and waiting, his whole small body asking the question. She reached up and slid the bolt back in 1 clean motion. Ricardo looked older than he had that morning. It was the first thing Angela noticed when she dropped down from the cavity and into the linen storage room below, that something had shifted in the architecture of his face. Not injury, something interior, of the kind of rearrangement that happened when a person confronted something they could no longer argue with. He checked Benjamin first, both hands on the boy's shoulders, then his face, then his hands. A rapid inventory conducted in silence, professional in its efficiency, except that his jaw was held very tight and his eyes were not professional at all. Benjamin pressed into him, and Ricardo held on in the way he always held on, like the boy was the only fixed point in a room that was trying to move. Then he looked at Angela. She was still holding the blanket. She had held it the entire time, through the passage, through the cavity, through the hours of stillness and counting and waiting. It was draped over one arm now, frayed edges trailing, washed thin from years of use and a month of Dorota's careful laundering. Ricardo looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You kept him safe," he said. But Angela said nothing. She was watching his face and reading the part he hadn't said yet. He straightened slowly. The Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the corridor light as he moved, that familiar flash. And she thought, not for the first time, about how much of him was assembled from things that announced power, and how far beneath all of it was something that had been trying, for weeks, to announce something else, entirely. "I need to tell you something," he said. He was looking at her directly. He had learned, somewhere across the past 5 weeks, that she didn't respect anything less than directness. "And I need you to hear it before I say it to anyone else." Benjamin had gone still against his father's side, listening. "I built something," Ricardo said, "and for a long time I told myself it was necessary, that it kept the right people safe and the wrong people at a distance." He paused. "Last night proved that I was wrong. My world followed me here, or into this house, into this wing." His eyes moved briefly to Benjamin, then back to her, toward you both. The storage room held the 3 of them in its small, dim quiet. Above, the storm was thinning. She could hear it losing force against the upper windows, the wind softening from a roar to something that was almost just weather. "I'm going to dismantle it," he said. "The organization, the network, all of it. There are people who can receive it, piece by piece, or can do less damage with it than I have." He said this plainly, without drama, the way he might describe rerouting a business operation. She understood that the plainness was the most honest version of what it cost him. It will take some months to do it cleanly, but it will be done. Angela watched him. "I want to adopt you," he said. "Legally, with papers and a process, and however long it takes to do it correctly." He let that sit for a moment. "Not because you need managing, or not because you need a roof. You have clearly demonstrated that you can manage yourself and find any roof in any building you choose." The corner of his mouth moved, briefly. "But because this family needs what you already are, and because you deserve to have that in writing." The word family moved through the room like a change in air pressure. Benjamin looked up at his father, and then at Angela with an expression of absolute, uncomplicated hope. Angela looked at her blanket, at its torn edges and its faded patches, and the thin places worn through from the weight of a winter she had survived alone. She thought about the blind strip near the groundskeeper's entrance, about the tree line, about all the routes she had plotted and not taken. She thought about the cognac leather chair, the bone china cup, the ceiling full of invented rivers. "I want my name on the papers," she said. "My real name, Angela." "Yes," Ricardo said, "and I keep the blanket." "I would not suggest otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment, the full inventory she had run on everyone who had ever made her a promise, the assessment she applied without apology. She found what she was looking for, or near enough to it. Not perfection, not certainty. Something more durable than both. A man who had chosen, at significant cost, to stop being what he was, for the specific reason of becoming something better. She had not thought adults were capable of that. She crossed the room and stood beside Benjamin. It was not an embrace. It was a positioning, deliberate, chosen, like every move she made. She was standing with them. Ricardo placed one hand gently on her shoulder. She did not move away. Outside, the storm finally broke. Light came through the upper window of the corridor, pale and clean, the particular light that follows hard weather when the world is scoured new. It fell across the marble floor in long, quiet shapes, and the estate held still around them, breathing. Angela looked at the light and felt, for the first time in a life that had been almost entirely without it, the specific and unfamiliar weight of having somewhere to be. She found she could bear it. She found, pulling the old blanket once more around her shoulders, that she didn't want to put it down. The papers were signed on a Thursday in March, but in a lawyer's office on the quiet side of the city, with Benjamin sitting between them on a leather chair too large for either child, swinging his feet and narrating the event for no one in particular. Angela signed her name in full. She had practiced the signature twice in private, so her hand wouldn't hesitate. It didn't. Ricardo sold the estate by summer. Too many rooms, he said, and too many memories built into the walls. They moved to a house with a garden. It was in a neighborhood where the streets were wide and ordinary, and nothing announced itself. Benjamin enrolled in school. Angela did too, a grade ahead of where anyone expected. Ricardo drove them both each morning in a car that was still expensive, but no longer armored. The blanket lived folded on the end of Angela's bed in the new house, within reach but no longer needed for warmth. Or she kept it because it was hers, the first thing that ever was, and because it had done its job so thoroughly that letting it go would have felt like ingratitude. She was not, by any measure, ungrateful. She was home. It's 3 a.m., and I'm still at my desk, making sure this story is perfect for you. If these characters touched your heart today, a small coffee would help keep me fueled for the next chapter. The link is in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe.